OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I'm a co-host along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, and Amy Brown Hughes. We're a collective that are interested in the intersection of biblical studies and theology. And this episode is going to be pretty different than other ones we've had. In fact, it's not even one we produced. This is a Regent College podcast episode. So you'll have two different co-hosts today, along with a different guest, Dr. Bethany Sollereder. And I asked if they would let us play this episode on our podcast, because I think it sounds some notes that resonate with some of the themes that have come up in previous OnScript episodes, and I felt like it would be worth playing and enjoyable to listen to. So you'll have two different co-hosts for this podcast. You have Claire Perini and also Octavio Fernandez y Mostajo, who are going to co-host for this episode. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and if you want more information or want to listen to other podcasts, you can look up the Regent College podcast. Special thanks for letting us play this on the OnScript feed, and you can also find out information at regent-college.edu. Thanks for listening.
Bethany, welcome to the Regent College podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here.
Good to have you. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we find in your book. It's very cool to have written a book called God, Evolution and Animal Suffering, Theodicy Without a Fall. So as we begin, I wonder if you can give us a bit of a sense of what do we mean by theodicy?
Yeah, thank you.
Theodicy is generally that branch of theology that deals with the questions like, why does God allow evil? Why is there sin in the world? What effect does it have? So anything trying to understand why a good God, who is also powerful, would allow evil is generally under the umbrella of theodicy. Now, there are more technical terms. So some people would say theodicy is a type of theology that actually tries to put forward the exact reasons God allows suffering. These are the reasons, whereas the other term is called a defense. And that's usually used when somebody is saying, I don't know if these are the reasons, but they're plausible reasons why God may allow suffering. Right. So a defense is a little bit less ambitious than a theodicy.
Okay, so it says theodicy without a fall. That's like a hypothetical world where the fall didn't happen, or what's that all about?
That's great. Yeah. So I was trying to be a little bit provocative in putting that subtitle in. And what my book deals with is only animal suffering, not human suffering. And it particularly deals with animal suffering throughout the evolutionary process. So when humans weren't around to have fallen in the first place. So although I do accept a human fall, I accept that sin entered the world and has messed up the relationships of creation between humans and the world around them. I don't think that had the effect of making lions go after gazelles or orcas after baby seals. I think that those were always in place as part of God's good creation. And that's giving myself a harder job, because then I've got to say, why would a good God allow this? Versus saying this is because of human sin or because of satanic sin. There are several people who will say the violence and competition that we see in evolution was never meant to be there. It's because Satan interfered from the very beginning.
And so then essentially what you're saying is that is this, am I hearing you right? In the sense that, so if we're assuming that there's a human fall, but that the human fall didn't necessarily impact the
animal kingdom?
In the animal kingdom or in creation more broadly, in the sense that there was death and life in creation before the fall?
And violence and the rest?
Yeah, there was violence. I mean, we know that. We know that dinosaurs ate one another. We can see the tooth marks of this kind of dinosaur on that kind of dinosaur's bones. We know that they had bone cancer. Things like disease and cancer were.
You actually know they had cancer? That's so interesting.
Yeah, we can see it in their bones. So that's not a new thing. I mean, cancer happens because we have genetic mutations.
Yeah.
And those same genetic mutations that cause cancer also allow us to be different from one another. They're what allow the sort of variety that give us evolutionary development. So we actually need that genetic mutation in order to change as life continues. We couldn't live without it. So yeah, cancer has always been around. It's not a result of human influence on the world.
Yeah, to ask the same question, because people might be listening and saying, okay, this lady, who, by the way, has a doctorate and she's super smart, is saying that the fall did not touch the animals. Are you crazy? And please tell me more.
Okay.
Because that's so, okay, I want to hear the whole thing. That's so interesting.
It touches animals in the sense of when I'm greedy and I use more resources and I eat more meat than the earth can sustain, I'm affecting animals. When I insist on my beauty products having palm oil in it, I'm contributing to the deforestation of the Amazon, right? So there are ways that we do influence the natural world in really terrible ways. And climate change is another example of how human overreach is causing problems. But the essential nature of life, that life depends on death, that creatures eat each other, that there is limited resources and more reproduction than those resources can supply, I don't think is a result of the fall. So even with humans, and this is possibly where I get more controversial, I don't think that we were ever made to be immortal here on this earth, but that immortality was always something we're called forward to. And what entered through the fall is that sin made death problematic. So the way we experience death is vastly different from what it would have been. And I think that sometimes in the lives of the saints and the lives of the martyrs, we see them inhabiting death in a very peaceful way, in a very joyful way. And I think that even under the worst circumstances, they're embracing it with joy. And I think there's something about that hearkening to a pre-fall experience of death, where you're simply saying, I'm walking through the door to find Jesus. Rather than this, I have to cling to life. So I think that human death, physical death, was always part and parcel of creation. And what we introduced was spiritual death and spiritual death's effects.
So there was always death, but sin just made it problematic.
Well, think about when Paul talks about death. I mean, in the two passages in Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 15, he says things like, I die every day, brothers. I mean that, and I myself no longer live, but Christ lives in me. So he's talking about death in ways that don't mean that his body died, but that he spiritually died with Christ and is spiritually raised with Christ. And yet, despite Jesus dealing with our sin problem, we still die physically. But though outwardly we waste away, inwardly we are renewed day by day. So I think that's more like what it would be. And from a scientific point of view, that makes a lot of sense. There's really no way to be immortal in this world that wouldn't be a huge problem for every other creature. In fact, cancer is a form of immortality. So what cancer cells have figured out is how to reproduce without limit. So whereas regular cells divide a certain number of times, then undergo apoptosis, a kind of cellular suicide, cancer cells will just reproduce forever and ever and ever and ever. And that's why they grow tumors. That's why they're so out of control.
So then the extent is that, so what you're saying is that then both natural evil and death existed before the fall. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. And that what we're talking about is then this kind of what it became problematic because of the spiritual death that then happened after the fall, as opposed to the physical death as opposed to a physical death. Okay. Yep.
So death was always part of the design for created creatures to die and end their cycle, right? That was okay.
Yes. And then we get to feed each other. I mean, Lord Wilkinson would often quote this Bertolt Brecht play where he would say, the motto of hell is eat or be eaten, but the motto of heaven is eat and be eaten. You know, so there's a sense of, when I've lived my life, then I give up my resources to other creatures. And as I've fed on others, they get to feed on me. And that's actually an idea that Charles Kingsley was talking about in the 1880s.
So then so the fall, I've always thought of the fall impacting humans and humans, or humans and God, humans and humans, humans and creation.
Yeah.
Does that theory still hold?
Yes, it does. But I would change the way we think about how that happened.
Yeah.
So, for example, in somebody like John Donne or somebody like C.S. Lewis, they would imagine a pre-fall world where bears wouldn't attack humans. You know, lions would never attack humans. And that was the proper relationship between humans and non-human animals. And I don't think that's right. I think that bears would have always been bears and would have always attacked humans. But I think we would have responded to being attacked by a bear differently. And so the image I sometimes use is we sometimes think about the fall as a virus. It's something that goes out, it infects all of creation, and all of creation starts acting sick. Right? But what I tend to use is more a metaphor that creation is like a symphony orchestra, where you have all the different sections doing their thing, and you've got a performance that's going on. Now imagine if one section, say the trumpets, goes rogue. Right. So they start just playing whatever they want. They're just making noises and everything like that. So their relationship to the rest of the symphony orchestra is messed up. They're not coordinated with themselves. And the conductor is going to be going, you know, what's up, guys? This isn't right. This is not how I'm conducting you to play. And the whole performance would be ruined by them acting in that way. But it doesn't mean that all the other instruments aren't doing the right thing, or that all the other instruments have gone out of tune suddenly, or like that, right?
Yeah, they're still continuing on.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think not many people have an issue with death itself, like being the end of beings. I think most people have an issue with suffering that comes before death. Right, like being attacked by a bear, or being part of of some sort of assassination or something, like being taken away the honor of your death, or the pain that comes before you leave the world. So I think that's more of the issue of people saying, okay, so there was that sort of high level suffering before the fall. So suffering was also part of the design. So people will say, like, I agree with death being part of the design. Okay, because everything, begins,
it's got to end. Something has
exactly.
To, yeah.
But what about the suffering? God would design suffering, give it a purpose, give it a place in the world He called good. So I think that's even more of the issue than death being there or not being there, right?
To answer that, I would put sort of my science hat on, as it were, and say, actually, when we look at what suffering does in living creatures, it's hugely beneficial. So if we looked at the early life where you have algae, floating around the ocean, or bacteria running around wild, they had very happy lives. There was no suffering. They just wandered around, swapped bacteria, swapped DNA, fed on.
So happy.
It was your peaceful world. There was no suffering, but there was also no love, no joy, no memory, no capacity for moral choice, right? And so when you get into more complex organisms, every branch of complex organism has developed the ability to suffer because it's protective. So
develop the ability of suffering. Oh, okay.
So like if I reach out my hand and touch the stove, I pull back because it's hot. Yeah. And I only know that because it causes me pain. So people who are born without the ability to suffer actually don't flourish. because they continuously hurt themselves and don't know how to protect themselves. So we actually need suffering to live well in a world where you can move around and be attacked, and there are harmful things. So the more sort of able you are, the more you're able to suffer. And so with social creatures, it's the same thing. The very same capacities, cognitive capacities that allow us to have great joy and great love are also the things that allow us to feel intense loneliness and regret and all of that. And so it's a bit of a package deal. You can't have the goods without the possibility of the harms.
Yeah. What I'm thinking is you said death was good, but then sin came and sort of quote unquote ruined it. And I think it would go kind of the same with suffering, because suffering was, like you said, an ability of that complex organisms developed in animals, but then came sin and maybe kind of ruined that good ability.
Yeah. So we suffer for the wrong reasons. You can suffer in a beneficial way. If you fall into a fire, you need to get out.
Yeah.
But if you're being tortured, now you're suffering for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
If you're suffering because you're in a war zone, I don't think that's what God intended. I don't think that is beneficial suffering. If you're suffering because you're being bullied or because you're being ostracized, that's a whole different ballgame from the type of suffering that would happen just naturally in the world.
Yeah, so like sin took suffering and perverted it, or took advantage of it, or used it for the bad?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's not to say, some of the suffering that we go through is quite good, So if my body is fighting off an infection, it's good that I feel bad, because then I stay home and lay down and let my body recover rather than go on my morning run and compromise my immune system yet further.
I'm thinking about nature, and because I was listening to a talk you gave at Regent 2 or 3 days ago, maybe something like that.
Yeah, last week.
And I was thinking about, a lot of people base their idea that sin infiltrated into nature with Genesis 3, and I'm sure you read it, but I'm going to read it so people can rehear it, hear it again. about when God curses, like quote unquote curses the land, and when it says it's Genesis 3:17, it says to Adam, he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat from it all the days of your life. It would produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat from the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat from the food until you return to the ground," etc., etc. So people understand, okay, there you go. God, because of the man, cursed creation. They normally say, I heard it said creation, and like sin entered every part of creation. So would you say the ground, being nature, plants, and like sin touched them?
Well, so that's a really complex passage, and there's a lot I could unpack. So, for example, Augustine, when he's talking about this in his commentary on Genesis, he says, well, thorns and thistles the ground shall bring forth to you. So he actually says, well, thorns and thistles grew before that because they're a pleasant food for donkeys and, other animals. It's just now that they're going to have a combative relationship with humans. So even in the history of tradition, we don't have necessarily the idea that this is the first time thorns and thistles started growing.
Okay.
I would maybe question Augustine a little bit, but one of the biggest problems with that passage is that people read to the end of Genesis 3, maybe they read Genesis 4, they hit the genealogies, and then they stop reading. And that's a problem because that story actually goes on. So you have the ground that's cursed in Genesis 3. It comes up again with Cain and Abel, that the ground is under this curse. And then when Noah is born, his father names him Noah, which means sort of release, and prays that God would release them from the toil on the ground. So Noah's father is saying, God, may you use this son of mine to undo that curse that's on the ground. And so then you have the whole decreation of the world in the flood event and God recreating. And after Noah offers his sacrifice, God says, I will no longer curse the ground. And in the whole rest of the Old Testament, you never get a place where you have those two words, the ground, the Adamah, being cursed, arar, again. So I think even in the Old Testament, you see the beginning of that story and the end of that story and a new creation with Noah. And so Noah, right, gets off the boat, he sacrifices, and then the ground is actually so fruitful that he makes this vineyard and makes an abundance of wine and gets mightily drunk, right? Because the ground is suddenly so fruitful after.
Yeah, that's the first time I heard that connection.
So actually, that was something that Ian Provan helped me work out. So he taught me some of that in his Genesis course.
So are there other aspects that the fall did or didn't impact?
Yes. It impacted human ability not to sin.
Yep.
And because of our sin, we then impact everything else in a more or less direct way. So we are impacting life through climate change. We're impacting life through factory farming and deforestation and adding, acidity to the oceans. And actually, I mean, the whole idea of us causing mass extinctions, we think of as sort of a post-industrial thing, but there's good evidence that anytime humans showed up on a new continent, we hunted everything that was large and tasty to extinction quite quickly. The only places we failed to do that were in Africa, where there's the coevolution. So the animals got big and strong just as quickly as we could get better at hunting them. And a few North American species like the bison managed to avoid extinction. But if you look at South America, North America, and up in Europe, things like the woolly mammoth, it looks like we've been causing extinction for a really long time.
That's so friggin' depressing. Oh, dang.
We've just always been humans, Yeah. Well, I mean, we came from other things that.
And in all of this, Bethany, you're assuming, what's beautiful about this is that what you're doing is integrating what we've understood about kind of evolutionary evidence and then what we're seeing in the biblical narrative and seeing that those two things are not in conflict with one another, but that actually what we're learning about, what we've learnt about the way the world is through evolution and whatever actually resonates with what we might understand the biblical narrative to say. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the science really tells an exciting story that gives us a whole lot of scope to not rewrite the Christian story. I don't think we should do that, but sort of retranslate it. So, I mean, Eugene Peterson did The Message. He translated the Bible into modern day parlance, idiom and style. So I'm just sort of saying, okay, let's throw science into the mix and see how the Christian story can be retold in a way that's coherent today. And in 200 years, when the science changes, as it absolutely will, then, future generations get to do the same thing and have the same fun.
Yeah. And that science isn't then undermining the biblical story at all, but that is helping us to kind of reimagine it in perhaps a deeper, fuller way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
What books could you recommend to people that are just thinking about, okay, this goes against everything I've been taught about, you don't open the door to evolution. You just don't, because once you do, you're lost. You're lost.
Yeah. I mean, if people just want to explore, there'd be a few different places they could go. The first, if they're looking for a very short set of things, not sort of book length, I would recommend the BioLogos website. It's biologos.org. Okay. And they've got just thousands of articles by many of the best people in the field, just starting with the very basic questions about what evidence do we have that evolution happened and how do we read Genesis, that sort of thing. If someone was looking for a slim book length thing, then I think Dennis Lamoureux, who's here at the University of Alberta, wrote a book called I Love Jesus and I Accept Evolution. And what's great about it is that he's really it tells his story about how he was when he became a Christian, he decided that he needed to prove evolution wrong. And so he went out to get a double PhD, a PhD in evolutionary biology and then a PhD in theology. And he did these both and went, oh, you know what? There's not a conflict here.
Yeah.
And evolution definitely happened when I look with my scientific eyes, and when I look with my theological eyes, I can see a different way of reading scripture. And so his short book, I Love Jesus and I Accept Evolution, is really good for those who want a bigger treatment, especially of the biblical questions. I would suggest his bigger book, Evolutionary Creation. Another book people have found useful is The Language of God by Francis Collins, or How I Found Peace with Science by Daryl Falk. And there's one by Dennis Alexander in the UK called Evolution or Creation, Do We Have to Choose?
Have you ever felt personally as some that you've had to choose at some point? Like, what's your journey been like personally as you've thought about these questions?
I mean, I didn't grow up in sort of a practicing Christian family. So when I started practicing Christianity when I was 15, I was already on board with evolution. So I remember having debates in Bible college and, people saying, oh, you can't believe the earth is old, you can't accept evolution. And I was kind of like, as long as God is the creator, that's all I care about. So actually, I was totally uninterested in science and religion because I just thought, I don't know, it's two scientists yelling at each other as far as I can tell. And that really doesn't matter to me at all. And what caught me was when I started understanding how bringing science to the table really starts challenging some of the hermeneutics. It really started making me ask questions about how do we read the Bible, what's in the Bible, and what does that mean today? And that was really exciting to me, was questions about how we read Genesis, and far less on the, science side of it. I mean, I like science, but I never had a huge problem with evolution. And I think that's okay. Like, I don't, if I'm in discussion with somebody or I have students who don't accept evolution, that doesn't really bother me. What I want to see is that they're willing to consider evidence and that they're willing to consider how they read the Bible. And if they walk away reading it the same way they did, that doesn't bother me. As long as they've taken the time to really think about why do I read the Bible this way, and what are the arguments from the other side.
How do we understand redemption then?
You've got such an easy question.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's kind of like if the biblical story is one of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. How do we understand the latter? So we've sort of talked about this kind of creation fall zone. How do we understand then redemption and then the consummation part? How do we help us understand that?
Yeah, because part of the argument there is it was beautiful before sin, and sin ruined everything. That's why we need redemption. So I know there's different points of view behind that, but that's part of it, part of the reasoning.
Okay. So what you have just described to me is sort of a U-shaped scriptural narrative where everything started at the perfect place and then it fell down, and then slowly a U-turn is done and we're going to get back up to redemption.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't read the biblical narrative in that way. I read the biblical narrative more like a ramp going upwards. And so what the fall was in my mind was not a fall from perfection, but rather something that was like a stumble on the way to growth. So I take sort of Irenaeus's view that Adam and Eve weren't morally perfect in the garden like Augustine was, but rather that they sort of stumbled as they grew. So the fall was more like a 6-year-old getting into the car and turning on the ignition, trying to drive out. They were grabbing at something that was meant to be theirs too early, and it was problematic for that reason. So if I have more like a ramp upwards, it means that redemption would have happened even if sin hadn't entered the world, that the new creation was always the end goal of creation and would have happened either way. So actually the end point looks quite similar in the terms of God needing to remake the whole world, that the whole world will be renewed. So everything that you'd read in Tom Wright's Surprised by Hope, all of that sort of thing is very much what I would adhere to. Yeah. I would just disagree on the beginning of how and why we need that.
Mm-hmm. So how does Jesus fit then?
Well, if we think about what Jesus does deal with the sin problem, right? But I think that Jesus would have been incarnate even if we hadn't sinned. I don't think that Jesus was like a plan B where God's like, oh no, they've sinned.
Oh, better do something about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Jesus is the culmination of creation. Jesus is where creation was headed all along.
Right.
And all we're trying to do, you know, what Jesus does is come and be the culmination of creation, but also deals with the sin problem. And whether we want to talk about different atonement models or whatever, I like them all. I like Christus Victor. I like, substitutionary atonement. I think these are all helpful slices of reality that help us see God's work. And so one of the ways I talk about redemption is kind of like a photographic mosaic. I think I talked about this in my lecture a little bit.
To talk more about that, because it's very compelling. Yeah.
So a lot of people think that, or one image that I've seen is that people talk about redemption like a tapestry that God's been weaving. And one day God's going to flip it all over and we'll see the design that was there all along. And I don't really like that image for a number of reasons. I think that one thread is not very different from another. There's no personal identity. They only make sense when they're put together.
Right.
But it also means that God's design has been for all the evil, for all the bad things to happen, you know, and I don't like that kind of an image. I'd rather say that evil happened against God's will, but God will work to redeem it. And so the image of redemption that I have is more like each of our lives are a little photograph. And what God will do is rearrange those photographs in the new creation to make a mosaic that portrays a beautiful new creation, a beautiful new kingdom, a bigger picture. And so that means that the meaning of each little pixel is only finally revealed, in a sense, when God remakes. That the meaning of the evil things that have happened will only be determined in the end. And so where is Jesus in that? I think Jesus is kind of two things. Jesus is the central pixel around which everything else is arranged. But Jesus is also the algorithm. Jesus is the reason that the final picture is one of peace and goodness and not like a terrible Hieronymus Bosch painting of terror. So you need both. You need something around which everything else organizes, and you need the algorithm that takes those disparate pieces and organizes them into that good.
Yeah. I guess you're not saying that Jesus is organizing those things from above, right? You know, moving the pieces, moving the pawns, moving, you know, from above like a puppet master, right? I guess you're saying he arranged that through incarnation in death, right?
Yeah,
is that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Because what I'm thinking is, at least how we're presented the gospel is, you have a problem, that's sin. Somebody had to pay for the sin, and that was Jesus. And now you feel bad because Jesus died in your place, right? And now he took your place, and now you have a right to eternal life, right? So in my head is that, I mean, it's been for years, that's the main reason. But when you say, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, that if sin wouldn't have entered the world, Jesus still would have come and be incarnate in the whole thing. So, okay, taking that hypothetical, what do you call it, hypothetical pathway or whatever, can you help me understand a little bit more or better that kind of concept of God, of Jesus still coming without a fall? And why would he come without a fall?
Yeah, I think Jesus would have come without a fall because creation is about relationship. And I think that God's intention was always to be united with creation, to take on creation. And so I don't know if you've heard the term deep incarnation.
No,
it's one that Niels Gregerson and Elizabeth Johnson and others, and they sort of say, look, we've told this story about Jesus came to save human sin and the substitutionary atonement and all of that, and that's fine. It's just not a big enough picture. Because Jesus becoming incarnate didn't only become human. He became living flesh. He became his DNA. He became carbon. He became oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen, all the things that make up the whole universe. And so Jesus was made mammal. Jesus was made vertebrate. Jesus was made living creature. And insofar as that's the case, we can expand how widely we see the stretch of the incarnation, to think of it as Jesus not just inhabiting humanity, but Jesus inhabiting the whole universe.
I really like that part when you say that our understanding of incarnation and salvation is very, very anthropocentric. And when you mention that, it's not just about us, the humans, the kings. It's not just about that. And I really that got me thinking for days. Actually, when I heard that for the first time, I was like, I went home, I told my wife, like, you know what you said? You know what you said? It's so anthropocentric. Hey, Jesus became carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. She was like, what we were having lunch, she was just looking at me like you don't get it, you didn't hear the whole thing. Yeah, and I really enjoyed that part. Oh yes.
Yeah, no, it's a really exciting view, and I think that's what caught me, was I just suddenly started thinking like, oh my goodness, this is so neat, and this changes how I want to live in the world. You know, if I'm going to eat differently, it's not going to be because I feel ashamed of being human, but because I understand how deeply my life is integrated with the lives of all of those around me, you know. And it means that when we participate in the natural world, when I go for a hike across the English countryside or in the Canadian Rockies, I'm in some way sharing in that incarnation of God, as the Spirit of God who lives in me, you know, is walking through the world. We're little ambassadors, but not only to humans, but to the whole natural world. And then you think of Francis of Assisi preaching to birds and that sort of thing. And I mean, I heard one time that Billy Graham used to preach to trees. And so when I used to walk my dog up and down the streets here, I used to preach to the trees when I was practicing. But I wasn't actually preaching to the trees. I was just practicing and pretending. Yeah. But now I have a wider sense. And I think, praise God, you trees.
Yeah. Because that would actually address some wild conversation I've heard. You know, like imagine there's a galaxy far, far away, and there's creatures, and they sin as well. Would Jesus die again for them? What do you think? And people say, like, of course Jesus would die for them because he loves them as well. So imagine there are like 10,000 galaxies. Yeah, Jesus would die 10,000 times again. But if you say he already became, nitrogen, like all the elements already, he's like, in that case, it wouldn't be necessary for him to die for all those 10,000 hypothetical galaxies. In a sense, it wouldn't, right?
No, he wouldn't need to for the salvation of sin, but he might want to be incarnate there anyways, just so that they could know him.
Okay.
Right? So again, if Jesus isn't coming as Savior, that doesn't mean that Jesus wouldn't be incarnate.
Yeah, I mean, it was a wild conversation.
These are important questions, because with all the work that's being done on exoplanets, how quickly we're finding them, and the research that we're doing on the origin of life is more and more showing that life is made of the most common elements in the universe, and the sorts of what is the word I'm looking for? The sorts of the way that the world was, the conditions, that was the word, that were on the early Earth look like they're probably abundant throughout the universe. And so if that's the case, it may very well be that the universe is full of life. And I think that God would, by all means, make God's self known to all those populations. So I think that Jesus was incarnate as a human because we had the cognitive capacity to understand what that meant. But I think God is also present to the bacteria, present to the wolves, present to the falcons and the mice, as much as they can contain, as much as they can understand.
Mm-hmm. So why did Jesus die?
In order to save us from our sin. I mean, I don't, but
that's still the same.
Yeah. That part's still the same. So, I mean, had Jesus not had to die for our sin, I think Jesus still would have bodily died, but wouldn't have died carrying the sin of the world.
Right. Yep.
So he would have died an old man, in his bed.
Yep.
Oh, interesting. Okay, different death.
His incarnate body when he was walking around Galilee, it was different from his resurrected body. Right? Just as ours will be. So he still would have had to walk through the doors of death, as it were, in order to be resurrected, just as we will have to.
Okay, for death's sake.
But he died on a cross, to redeem us from sin.
Clear? Oh, clear? Super clear?
It's all super clear. I got it. Nailed it.
It is just fascinating just hearing you talk and just, I don't know, obliterate you with more questions and more questions. We'd love to do that, but our time is running out.
Yep.
So I would love for you to give you some space to say whatever you want to say that you might have thought it was just left out and might be misunderstood somehow. Just give you space to say something else.
Yeah. I think one of the most important things is how we treat the world today. I think that climate change is a pressing global issue. The world's just been through its hottest July in history. And that's not just in human history. That's as far as we can tell in Earth's history.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So I think that we really need to be active. I think this is a place where Christians have been behind the curve when it comes to being part of saying we need to take action to help the earth be a good home to all its humans and non-human inhabitants. And so it really is time to work through our theology in such a way that we can get on board with those who are saying we need to make changes.
Right.
Not because I don't believe in the new creation, not because I don't believe that God acts in the world, but what sin tells me is that God allows us to experience the results of our sin. God doesn't save us from those things. And so for the world of our children and our grandchildren, we need to start making change now.
Yep.
Thank you. Could you plug your book and any articles you have?
Well, there are articles on BioLogos that are freely available. There's a couple in Christian Century that I think one is The Purpose of Dinosaurs is freely available. The other one is behind a paywall. My book is a problematic thing to plug because it is so expensive. Routledge put it as an academic book.
Oh, no.
So it's I think at the Regent bookstore, it was listed at $195.
Oh.
But if people really want to read it, Routledge has given me a private paperback copy that I can get on demand and print and sell to people for more like $35.
Oh, yes.
Plus shipping and handling. So if people really want to read a copy, they should just get in touch with me by email.
Your email is?
Bethany.Sollereder@theology.ox.ac.uk.
Bethany, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for all the work that and thinking that you're doing around this challenging issue, but actually the more you talk about it, makes lots of sense.
It's not so bad.
It's not so bad after all.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to
It's been a pleasure. Hopefully
Hello,
we'll do
Regent
this.
World.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Write something else crazy and like mind-bending.
I've got something on the go.
Oh, yeah.
We'll talk again.
Okay, thanks, Bethany.
Bye, Bethany.
See ya.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to the Regent College podcast. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To discover more about Regent College, its upcoming events, conferences, courses, and more content like this, visit regent.net. That's rgnt.net.